Like,
Can you hear me now? Okay. I guess I get everybody's attention. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Camilla Fair, and I'm a board member for Move to Prosper, the lead organization for building inclusive communities initiative. Move to Prosper is a nonprofit that empowers low-income families and their children to gain economic security. We equip families with tools they need to flourish, including career and financial coaching. Our partial rental support enables them to move to neighborhoods with quality housing and schools and safe environments for their children. Working together, Move to Prosper families set and achieve personal goals. In our recently completed pilot program, Move to Prosper families raised their incomes by 58% and $17,000 on average, and improved their mental and physical health. We are supporting public awareness efforts about how to solve the housing shortage in Central Ohio, which is the reason for the program this evening. Move to Prosper and 24 other organizations have partnered to bring you the Building Inclusive Community series. The sponsors and partners are listed on the screens. I'd like to particularly thank Park National Bank for their assistance with our fall programming and the Harvard Low Fellowship Collaboratory for providing our guest speakers. Now it is my privilege to introduce our moderator for the evening program, Amelia Robinson. Amelia is she's a graduate of Ohio University. At the Columbus Dispatch, Amelia launched Columbus Conversation, a digital town hall series on issues important to the community. And she hosts Then What Happened podcast. Last year, Amelia was named the Ohio Associated Press Managing Editor's Best Editorial Writer. Please join me in welcoming our program moderator to the stage, Amelia Robinson.
Thank you for that awesome introduction. I feel like I think as excited as I am to talk about this important issue to our community housing, of course, is that issue. And we have some fantastic presentations that I am excited to introduce. Our first guest speaker is Julie Campoli, who is a 2010 Harvard University Graduate School of Design Loeb Fellow and holds a master in landscape architecture from Cornell. She is the author of 2 books. One is Made for Walking, Density and Neighborhood Form, and she is co-author of Visualizing Density. Julie's Burlington, Vermont-based practice, Terraformer Urban Design, specializes in town design, landscape analysis, and site planning for affordable housing. Julie will make a brief presentation, and we're going to have Eli Spevak come to the stage after Julie, and he is also very accomplished. Eli is a 2014 Harvard University Graduate School of Design Loeb Fellow and the founder of Orange Plot LLC, a development and general contracting company, and that pioneers new models of community-oriented, affordable green housing in Portland, Oregon. Previously, Eli worked for over a decade in the nonprofit sector, managing the finance and construction of affordable housing. Eli guest teaches classes in Portland at Portland State University's Urban Studies and Planning program. He holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Portland State University and a physics degree from Fort Worth College. Julie and Eli, it's all yours to dazzle us with all this exciting development and housing information.
I'm here to talk about density, why people dislike it, generalized fear about growth and change, and I'd like to suggest ways to talk about density that in a much more productive way, and the role that design plays in creating the kind of density that people tend to want. But first, it's really important to think about where some of those negative attitudes of density come from. When you think the word density, what comes to mind? If you have not lived or spent any time in cities and you've watched a lot of television and movies in the last couple of decades, then this kind of image might pop up in your head. If it's not doing that for you, it's sure that it's a lot of other people are thinking about this. It's a stereotype from the distant past about everything that's wrong with cities. Most people don't have the ability to visualize density. One person might think about this. Maybe if you're an architect or planner, you can see this as a form of density, but you can bet that people are often thinking about something like this, and with good reason, because a lot of development across the country has not been all that great. So people are surrounded with images like this, and this is come to mind. And a density number doesn't help give any sense of what a neighborhood is like. Try to guess the density of these places, which is more dense. Central New Jersey or St. Johnsbury, Vermont. The form can vary very widely within the same density. And a different design approach creates very different places. A neighborhood can be very appealing or it can be very off-putting at the exact same density level. So it's not at all about the number. And it's helpful to know how density is expressed. There are density measures that are very common. Basically a ratio that conveys the number of people or homes on a unit of land. And you can also apply this ratio to other urban elements like buildings or jobs or parking spaces. And this gives a measure of how intensively land is used. And there's a very deep common misconception that density means crowding, but it's not at all the same. One is a mathematical ratio, and the other is a feeling. So what feels crowded? A place with a lot of people living in an insufficient number of housing units. And this usually occurs when people can't afford rent. So they squeeze in with relatives or others. And South Central Los Angeles is an extreme example of this. Probably the most crowded place in the United States. But many US neighborhoods are becoming overcrowded for the same reason. High rents, low incomes. So this is a situation where adding more housing units would make it much less crowded. And then there's a phrase that you hear a lot, jammed in together. Those buildings are all jammed in together. And sometimes people associate crowding with recent housing because in the last 60 years, the lot sizes have remained the same size generally in the US, and the houses have doubled in size. So you get a situation like this, where they actually are all jammed together, but it's not dense in any kind of productive way because the few people are living here. This is a neighborhood that has a density of 2.5 units per acre. High building coverage, but you're not really getting the benefit of all of that building. So development conversations go better if you talk about housing in terms of the needs of the community, the house types that will meet those needs. This makes the discussion way more meaningful because it puts the focus on design rather than density number. So think about, okay, what does a duplex or a townhouse or a small apartment building look like? But sometimes it's not about aesthetics or design. People see signs of change like construction sites or taller buildings or disappearing green space, and then they blame the redevelopment that is occurring in their community they blame that for other changes that are happening, like increased traffic or fewer parking spaces. Even if those developments are not actually causing it, that association is made. Or change their experience like traffic, more traffic on the roads. So they're not really experiencing the benefits of density, they're experiencing any kind of development as a loss. It feels like a loss. So it's important to talk about redevelopment in a way that emphasizes the benefits. And I like to use the word proximity rather than density because it expresses the positive quality of density that enables wonderful things, benefits that it brings like walkability and convenience. If you tell someone, do you want a walkable neighborhood? They'll probably say yes. And that requires density. Density is one of the things, one of the ingredients. Research shows that people are healthier and happier if they have a chance to walk regularly. And most people want to be able to walk to work. They want to have that choice, and they want to be able to walk to other destinations. People feel like they need to get more exercise, but when it's just left as up as a recreational opportunity, you often don't get it. But when you walk for transportation, you're much more likely to regularly walk. But this kind of proximity requires density. And proximity makes possible other greater mobility for people. People that can't drive yet, or no longer can drive, or people that can't afford a car. And it gives them a chance to get around there on their own without asking someone else for a ride, which is just a basic human freedom that everybody wants. It's also helpful to think of density as people. They're riders or customers. And you can't have a transportation alternative in a low density place. There's a certain threshold. You can have bus service at 3 to 4 units an acre, but if you want it to actually not be heavily subsidized or to be convenient and actually used, it needs to be at least 7 to 8 units an acre. And if you want really convenient service, then 15 units an acre. And if you're thinking that a bus rapid transit system might be wonderful, which it is, at least 15 units an acre around those station areas. And most people say they would like to be able to walk to a corner store. That's something they like in their neighborhood. But a merchant is not going to locate in a place where there aren't very many people living nearby. So you need at least 6 units an acre to support a corner store. And then if you want a full service supermarket with healthy produce and meats and a wide selection, then that is going to take about 12 units an acre. But sadly, most American neighborhoods fall well below these thresholds, which means more and longer car trips to get people what they need to get to where they need to go. So when you have a community conversation about growth and people say they want appropriate or responsible or thoughtful growth, define what that is, because those are very vague terms, and use images, not words. You're much more likely to get good design by defining it, explaining it, and regulating it. I have done visualizing density workshops around the country. We did 2 today. They were quite satisfying, in which we show sets of images of neighborhoods of the same density close up and in their larger context. And we ask people to describe what they see, what they like, what they don't like, and then ask the group to articulate the common principles of the things they like the best and the things they like the least. And it's kind of consistent across the country in communities of various sizes at very different density levels. The same expressions come up to express the bad density: boring, monotonous, car-oriented, looks like the kind of place you wouldn't live for very long. And these are the characteristics that you don't want. But more importantly, the attributes that are associated with good density are where you want to focus. And these are also consistent. Lots of trees, lots of greenery, contact with nature, connected sidewalks, a sense of uniqueness in the place, and certainly a place that's comfortable for pedestrians to walk around. So urban design is key, but most people haven't been exposed to basic urban design principles. They don't understand what the jargon is. They don't understand how it works. So it's really important to learn them yourselves or to explain them to the public and why they're important, and demystify the language and help people to see, okay, this is what we're talking about. What are the different physical characteristics that's going to affect the look and feel of new development? And what should they be so that we get the kind that we want? So be clear about what you want and show it rather than describe it. And design really matters. Ugly buildings are irritants, and they are constant reminders of why, in people's mind, of why growth is bad. And it's a reason for them to fear more change. But good design makes it easier for people to see change as positive. And these are the common arguments against development. Many are not design related. And you can address them with information and data, but in the end, facts don't always win the day. Because at the root of so many battles over development is the basic fear of change. And as a species, we're not that great with change. Human beings are hardwired to feel loss, and research shows fear loss. And research shows that people feel pain from loss much more intensely than they get pleasure from gain, which is kind of remarkable. And think about the last time you lost something and how hard you tried to get it back. So this loss aversion often leads us to fall into two camps: the deeply skeptical and the absolutely opposed. And there's a tendency to imagine the worst. We generally prefer to keep a status quo than risk getting something awful. Even if the chances of a building like this going up in your neighborhood are extremely low, you don't want to take that chance, so you tend to fall into a defensive posture. Another reason why people fear change in their neighborhood is that they sense that the process isn't quite fair, that someone will win and some will lose. And many might legitimately wonder, will I still have a place after all the change? Will I still belong here? Even if I can afford to stay, will the neighborhood become an unfamiliar place? Will it be too fancy with unfriendly people? Will it still feel like my home? And there's a fear that someone else is benefiting from your loss. The swooping developers, in this case, the people from California. There's always somewhere else that is a threat. Someone's coming in. And then, of course, now we're all so familiar with this element of tribalism that's firmly entrenched in the US right now. We tend to be comfortable with people like us. And we may identify ourselves as an urbanite, city dweller, or a suburbanite, or an environmentalist, or a Republican, or a Democrat. And it's very easy to mistrust anyone that's outside of your group and assume that they are wrong. So it's crucial to treat members of other tribes with the same respect that you do your tribe. And despite our fear of change, one thing you can be sure of, it's going to happen. It always has, and it always will. But the good news is that once that change has happened, we're really good at adapting to it. Okay, so human beings fear change, but we adapt to it. The shockingly new eventually becomes familiar, and then oftentimes it becomes beloved. So things are going to change. The question is, how is it going to change? And how can you, as a member of the community or someone on the planning commission, a developer, how are you going to shape that change into something wonderful? Thanks.
Being our crutch up here. Well, nice to be here. I'm glad to be back. Couple things for my intro. One is I served on our planning commission for 7 years, so I've heard a lot of public testimony. Yeah, everyone to come up here afterwards to hear your input. The other is that I come from Washington, D.C., so I talk kind of
Or
fill those out and to hand those to our volunteers. Also, if you're watching online and you have a question, feel free to put them in the chat. We're gonna get to as many of those questions as possible. We really want to make people more aware of the situation and solutions around that.
about how many parking hotels you're at, how to use it. Apparently more than zero.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. We'll get started now. So my presentation, the portion thereof, will be reintroducing affordable homes for today's smaller households. Because really, we're legalizing things that we've been doing since we started building this country. I also work sometimes with AARP, and through them, I've learned a few things that I didn't know before. One is that 3/4 of people over 50 want to stay in the homes in their communities where they live right now. Many people, their parents got old in an environment that wasn't so nice. Want to do better than that. Part of that means staying put. Home sharing is on the rise. 1/3 of homeowners would be interested in creating an accessory dwelling unit if it were legal. And people want company. The isolation and loneliness are terrible for health, worse than obesity. So some of the inspirations for me, if anyone has kids in this audience, the Big Orange Squad is a great kids book. I copied that name for my book. You might know why if you see my projects. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. row house. I've lived in a house, went back and forth between a house and duplex over the years, lived in a courtyard 1938 plex in Portland, and now I live in half of this duplex you see in the picture with solar panels on it in a co-housing community I developed in Portland. I also reached back to historic precedents. We've got some examples going all the way back to the 1800s of housing types that are starting to research today. And although to solve your housing problems, you need to have a wide variety of housing types. I'm going to focus on a smaller range of homes. So if you have sort of this continuity from single family detached housing to 5-story buildings, I'm going to focus on sort of like the things at the same scale of a single family house, but rather than the monocrop that sometimes you see grows out of suburban land development, we're going to look at more of a variety of housing types, lot by lot basis, so each home can be a little bit different. One of the starting points is row houses. I grew up in one, I'm biased, but we have them here in Columbus. I built some in Portland, and this is an incredibly efficient housing type for energy efficiency and also for land use. It's also great for trick-or-treating, as you just had. The doors are frequently spaced. And we've got cottage clusters. This one, the historic image there is from a community just outside of Washington, D.C. called Washington Grove, which was a Methodist church gathering spot. And it eventually became a year-round location, and it's there still today. These same buildings clustered around roads, cars can't even get there, but you're on the light rail line. More recent versions of it are, this Ross Chapin's a fantastic architect developer. He does these clusters where you have maybe twice the homes that would typically be allowed on a lot, but they're half the size. They're like 1,200 square feet, and they're clustered around common greens, sometimes even a common house. So people have more right-sized housing for the households that we're seeing today. Here's a couple more pictures of different layouts. Sometimes you can fit on awkwardly shaped pieces of land that it wouldn't work for a traditional subdivision. Here's a project that I developed. It's in Portland. It's 2 acres with 16 homes on them. But instead of doing like a typical cul-de-sac where you have a road up the middle and parking on each and homes on each side of the thermometer, we have the parking on one side. The homes are clustered in groups of 2 and 3 as sort of angles around the courtyard, and we have some shared courtyards and a common house in the middle. And over time, when people start landscaping in front of their homes, which they own, you end up getting really a vibrant, lush environment. And it's a fun place for people with kids or people who are empty nesters who wish they had kids around. Another idea is a duplex. In Portland, we've allowed corner duplexes for 30 years. Every corner lot you can do a duplex. One unit faces one street, the other faces the other street. There's plenty of parking available on the street, and there's that's where we're massing a block makes sense. But of course, we have mid-block duplexes also, and the building code favors duplexes because you can build it under the standard residential code. We also sometimes have situations where existing homes are really big. I've been here, I've seen a few of those. San Francisco has like 14-bedroom houses from back when families were really big. Those get repurposed sometimes by dividing them internally into multiple units. So the upper left, this is a triplex now, originally a big house. Upper right is a historic home in Northwest Portland that is now 9 units. And some other examples as well. Accessory dwelling units. I wrote a book with AERP on this, not a book, it's a pamphlet, the ABCs of ADUs. There's some on the table, you can call them, I'll send you one for free or download it. But this is a less expensive housing option that many communities are legalizing. In this case, I got one down the street from me. It's a detached home built on the side yard of family. Converted garage, you can build a new house with an ADU built into it, as in the bottom left here. Basement ADUs are, most of these are invisible from the street, basement ADUs particularly so. You get even smaller by going to detached bedrooms, which has a legal living space with egress window, smoke detector for someone to sleep, a bathroom, but not really a full kitchen, maybe a hot plate, but not a full kitchen. It had a full kitchen, we call that an accessory dwelling. And even smaller, we got the wagon on wheels, right? And we got tiny houses, and a lot of people live in tiny houses, more than you would realize. Sometimes practice gets ahead of zoning. That's certainly the case in my city, where you had in inventory in my neighborhood, there were more people living in tiny houses than there were in accessory dwelling units. And this is like 60 ADUs and more than, and they weren't necessarily cute tiny homes like this. Sometimes they were, mobile homes and people living in them. Though you can tell by the extension cord it's in the driveway. But we finally got around to legalizing it because we'd rather, frankly, have people have plumbing and support go legit than have those same vehicles be pulled out on the street. Some of them are awfully cute, like this one too. This is the Lucky Penny. And sometimes tiny homes are in community. You have little clusters of them. Tiny House Caravan Hotel in Washington, D.C., the Boneyard Collective is on the edge of a cemetery, but people live there full time. Sometimes people have community by necessity. This is a group I work with called Dignity Village, where 60 households built their own homes with pride of ownership on public property after they've been moved by the city from place to place with shopping cart brigades. They're still there now, 20 years later. Self-formed homeless communities where they built their own homes. The boarding house, bring it back. I mean, that used to be the way inexpensive market rate lodging was, where you pay by the night and have your food. Well, I don't know anyone who's actually cooking in that situation, but people are certainly repurposing large multi-bedroom homes to have room by room rentals with a common area, and usually one of the rooms wouldn't be rented and it's available for guests. I developed one project like this. There's actually 2 side-by-side lots. Each lot about an 8-bedroom house with a 3-bedroom ADU, and then a mirror image 3-bedroom ADU, 8-bedroom house, 22 bedrooms, managed to be a community, and it works great. There's pictures of it right now before people moved in. That's 2 years ago. We moved in during COVID and actually leased up quite well. Even imagine doing a COVID-friendly co-housing project. It's hard. So co-living isn't anything new, though. It sounds foreign. Just the young people do it right? Nope. It's been around for a little while. You got the Lottery, you got the frat house, you got the senior living facility. It's all versions of co-living. And of course, if you watch TV, you get Melrose Place. So a little more time on the accessory dwelling unit, because that's something that is of all the different ways to add a few homes into neighborhoods, existing neighborhoods, without tearing anything down. This one is the most politically palatable. So of course, you got your famous ADU dwellers. You probably all know these folks. Fonz, of course, lived on Mr. Cunningham's garage. Jefferson built a tiny house, accessory dwelling unit, while he was married, had the first 2 kids, while they were building Monticello. That was the traditional way you built houses back in the day. You built a little house first, and then you live in there while you build the big one. And of course, you got in the basement, you got Sesame Street, basically. Ernie and Bert, you got Mork in the attic, and you have Oscar living in the front yard. Usually ADUs are not allowed in the front yard, but Oscar's not really a rule follower. So there's too many names for these things. I know in your neck of the woods, they're oftentimes called carriage houses, maybe a coach house. Whether they're legal in your zoning code or not, you still have them. People still live in them, whether they're not supposed to. But other parts of the country have other names for them. But the definition of an ADU is a smaller, fully independent home on the same lot as a primary dwelling, main house. And it's got its own kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom facilities. And it could be attached to the main house. It could be detached structure, or it could be an appendage added on to it. It's like an addition. Any one of those would be an ADU. And most places that allow ADUs allow all 3 of these permutations. So why are people interested in this kind of housing? The main reason is that it adds a choice. Like if you want to live in a small 800 square foot unit, in most cities, your only choice is an apartment building. That's it, or a high rise maybe. Most of cities are zoned single family. It can be up to 60–70% of the land area. And most of that housing is, well, increasingly 2,000 square feet or larger. Even Portland, where I live, where we're known to be kind of progressive, this is our zoning now. The yellow is single family zoning. Now we have since made single family zoning not really mean single family zoning anymore, but the most of the land area is really low density zoning. The other reason it's familiar, like it's not just like the new kids who know about ADUs. People who are older were in ADUs when they were kids. It's been around forever, since before zoning. Most people don't create ADUs for one purpose. They create them because they have one main idea, but they also have like 3 backup plans. And over time, the ADU will change from one use to another. So at one point, it might be a family builds the ADU for additional rental income, or for the grandparent to come help raise the kids. And then as the kids grow up, then maybe the teens get to be in the ADU, or maybe has someone as a home office at the ADU, or becomes a COVID shelter. $58 to $961, almost 4 times. So either we're getting a lot fatter, or we do a lot more elbow room. But it really means that we are not building the housing that matches our population, and we need to provide a wider range of housing options. So I'm all for creating single-family homes. That's great. We need some, but what we really need is things that are smaller than that also. Environmental benefits is what really drew me to this in the first place. 80% of the houses per greenhouse gas footprint has to do with conditioning the space. It's not the embodied energy. Some of it's the embodied energy of creating the building, but the vast majority of it is just heating and cooling. And this is true for Oregon's climate, which is mild. In more severe climates, it's even more dramatic than this. If you just carve off 600 square feet off a house, then that's just as good as going full LEED certification. And that's like from a 2,200 to a 1,600 square foot house, get down to 800 square foot house, and you've cut your greenhouse gas emissions dramatically. Affordability is another reason people like ADUs. On average, an ADU, 800 square foot ADU rents for a little bit more than an 800 square foot apartment because it's nicer, it's in a nice neighborhood. And 20% of them are rented for nothing because someone is making the ADU available to a friend, a family, a loved one who otherwise would be out there competing on the rental market. No public subsidy needed. People are making housing available for free. It's a good niche for small and emerging contractors and architects. And a few more reasons. It's politically palatable, as I said. It's discrete. The density is dispersed. For anyone who's concerned about a 40-unit apartment building showing up in their neighborhood, they don't seem to be that concerned about having ADUs sprinkle all around town. The parking impact and property rights is another reason. One of the big reasons why California now legalizes ADUs in every city is because the red part of the state said, well, you should tell me I can't, carve off that part of the house I never use anymore and put a new door on the outside and rent it out. Like, this is a deregulation program. And then aging in place in a neighborhood. So I'm gonna, get to what everyone's really afraid of. What if you legalize these things? Are they gonna take over? A lot of cities legalized them back in 2000 with all these rules on them, and no one ever built a single one. So the goal is to actually write an ADU code that responds to local concerns. Like, is your big issue parking? Is your big issue under occupancy? Is your big issue design compatibility with the other building? Pick one of those things and put it in your code and let the other stuff drop, because that's what you need to get the code actually used. If you want to see the sample code, they're pretty simple and sweet. We got one of them in that little pamphlet we did, ABCs of ADUs. And there's a lot of other guidelines from ADRP on this. But it's important to realize that the reason ADUs don't get built that much, as you would think, is because they don't get built by professional developers. So if you remember back at the beginning of the presentation at single family homes, those are definitely built by professional developers. You've got 5-story buildings, the same. ADUs are unique in the housing industry that they are built by amateurs, people who do not know what they're doing. The biggest thing they ever did was the home renovation project, and now they're going to design something to build in their yard. They're going to hire a contractor for the first time, get an architect for the first time, or maybe they're going to try and do some of it themselves. They take forever, but go back one slide here. Because of that, even in a city like Portland, which went from 20 ADUs a year, 2010, to more than 1 ADU per day 5 years later, between 2 and 3% of homes have ADUs. It is not an easy thing. So even if you have really easy to follow rules, you're not going to get that many. Lots of states are doing this. I know this never happened in Ohio, but 8 states in the United States require every city to allow ADUs because they want to have a variety of housing choices. Some cities, first off, Fayetteville, Arkansas, allow 2 ADUs on every lot, 1 internal, 1 detached. The state of California, every city in California has to allow 2 ADUs, and it is not falling apart. And going beyond ADUs, you get other housing types. And this I'm going to just mention briefly because I think this might be relevant here. One is to allow more of your housing to be built by right. When you have to go through the discretionary process, it stops projects. It stops your ability to meet your housing goals. Remove or relax parking mandates. And I should say all of these are like deregulation things. So if you have deregulation in the politics here, these are examples. Sure, you're going to build parking on your housing locally, but you might not build as much as your zoning code says you have to build. If your zoning code building, you need to put a thumb on the scale. Expanding options within traditionally single-family neighborhoods, that's like residential infill projects I'll show in a minute, and legalize least cost housing options. And lastly, if you've got nonprofit or faith-owned properties and they want to create affordable housing, give them the zoning to do it. So in terms of changing your housing in your single-family zones, one thing is to do what we did in Portland, which is to say, look, what matters is the bulk, the massing, the main big structure and a small little structure. Who cares if that's a house, a duplex, a house with an ADU, fourplex even? Allow that option. Another is, and at the same time when we did that, by the way, we scaled down how big you could build the structure. So it was like a protocol pull and push and pull. And then the other is to really to make your least expensive housing affordable. So get rid of household definitions. Why should we criminalize people for being housemates with each other? So I put down here, would Mike and Carol Brady legally cohabit in your city without getting married? A lot of times cities have occupancy limits, which are really not related to life safety, it's related to how many people are, how they're related to each other. Remove barriers to single room occupancies, SROs, group living, allow a second kitchen in a home so that people can cohabitate their own, which is the home they're doing anyway, but not have to share a stove. Allow if you're doing providing shelters for people otherwise unsheltered, allow that by right in a few more zones than you do right now. You might want to allow tents, tents, yurts, small cabins or vehicles as an option for people otherwise would be tent camping neighborhoods. And the others legalize tiny homes on wheels. We now allow them on every residential lot. Of course, that doesn't happen in every lot, but quite a few of them it does. And the last item is just in case this is a situation here, if you have some, we did a project in Portland where we identified 16 faith-based owned properties. We upzoned them with the condition that they're using for affordable housing. They were going to sell the property anyway because they couldn't afford to keep it. The congregation was closing, and they got more money for the property because of this. And several of those are now under development for affordable housing right now. And I'm going to close it at that. Thank you. Sorry about that.
All right, so we're going to bring our panelists to the stage to join our speakers. We have first Jonathan Moody, who is an architect and CEO of Moody Nolan, a Columbus-based architecture firm with offices in 12 cities across the US. And he is the winner of the 2001 American Institute of Architects National Architect Firm Award. Jonathan holds architecture degrees from Cornell and UCLA. I was going to say you go to all the schools, man. That's very important. So he established Moody Nolan Care, the firm's community service wing, and was instrumental in creation of the Moody Nolan Legacy House program, which is really awesome. And hopefully we can talk about that a little bit too. Come on up, Jonathan. And also we're going to bring up Jennifer Clark, who is a professor and head of the city and regional planning section at Ohio State University. She teaches courses on urban and regional economic development and has provided expert testimony before the US Congress in policy advice and consultation to the Canadian, UK, and US governments. So welcome to them both. Or if you have a question for our panelists, feel free to Art, and they will get them to me. You have a question? So the first question, obviously the name of the program is Building Inclusive Communities. And you talk about inclusive communities, you have to talk about diverse and equitable communities as well. Where does that whole discussion come into play when we talk about this subject? And any one of you guys can take that. You want to go first, Sean?
Well,
I looked at you, so you have to go first.
so yeah, you did look at me, but so I guess for me, the question was about, we talk a lot about density, we talk about a lot about, I really like the framing around thinking of using the appropriate words, like not necessarily density, but maybe proximity and looking at scale and rethinking it. But yours was about
Hey, I go.
yeah. Well, so for me, where it starts is the reality is when we look at like buildings in general, like building trends follow population trends. And I think we're now at a point where, most people live in cities and the makeup of cities, when you kind of look at the US population, just kind of overall demographics, kind of, it's different than it would be as a city. Like for me personally, like looking at Columbus, you take the African-American population, it's like 12 or 13% across the US, but it's depending on how you qualify it, it's 29% here in Columbus. And so what that means is the makeup is different. And when you're talking about density, more often than not, you're talking about some of the histories that have contributed to that. So when you talk about building in these communities, it really kind of forces you to kind of come to terms with a lot of the passions and histories that have led to some of those changes. So the reality is, more often than not, when you're talking about building denser, building more urban, you're talking about automatically building more equitably because you're catering to communities that have been historically overlooked. It's yeah.
Part of the history that we reckon with is that in my community and many others, single-family zoning was used to keep lower-income people out, who also happen to be people of color in many ways. So in some ways, opening up a wider variety of housing options opens up housing for a wider range of people. There is also a need to zone for multifamily zoning, and there are some communities in New England, as one example, where whole communities are only zoned single family, so there's literally nowhere to put multifamily development, which is how affordable housing is financed in this country pretty much.
I would just add the sort of perspective from regional economic development planning, which is that for many years we thought about equality as not being directly related to the question of whether regional economic growth is good and forward. And what we've found in more recent research is that inequality within a region actually limits the growth of the region overall. It really pulls back. And so this question about, can we have some people, we can have the region growing while we foster inequality within the region, that's actually, we're all losing when we do that. And I think that one of the things that we have to remember, and we're sort of talking about it here, is that when we're talking about housing markets, it's not delinked, it's not different from understanding how our labor markets operate. You're not going to have functional labor markets without having functional housing markets. And we think about this, if you think about this as the question of, are we providing housing for the labor market as a whole? We all kind of want to think that we're building houses for knowledge workers and that, somehow that's going to work. And that's actually not how it works well over time. We see this in the growth patterns in terms of wealth creation for the region. And we also see this in agglomeration diseconomies, which, that's my little economic development certificate. But we talk about all the benefits we get from having things like an Intel factory and then all of the other sort of clusters of high-tech firms. There's also, when you create a lot of concentration, like you get things like diseconomies, and those diseconomies are things like congestion. Think about Atlanta. If you think about failures in housing market, think about people who are working class trying to find a place to live in Silicon Valley. It doesn't work really well. And these are the things that are so nice about Columbus. And people talk about Columbus, we have this kind of balanced environment in some ways. And we think about how is that growth going to work in such a way that it's equitably distributed. Some of the solutions that you're proposing about thinking smart about growth, thinking smart about building, thinking smart about our neighborhoods is crucial to keeping that sort of quality of life that Columbus has come for.
For the widespread embrace of zoning, there was so much more integrated. There were rich people living next to poor people. There was enterprise going on in people's garage backyards, in their accessory sheds, and there was just a much more mixing. At some point, we just became terrified of it, and we started putting in place these regulations. There's different parts of town, different things. And this really became clear when we were doing the visualizing density. Trying to get close so that you can hear me. You hear me now? Yes? No? Here we go. Wait. Whole neighborhoods that have the exact same size of house next to another neighborhood that has a larger house, many larger houses, and then another neighborhood that has a smaller house. And at some point you just think, how did this happen to the code? Is this a real estate development marketing strategy? Or is this basically we're just afraid to someone of a different social class? But it's so widespread, and I think it's been supercharged by our own population.
So we were talking earlier, Julie, about, first of all, Columbus maybe not realize how big it is. Sometimes people in the outside world perhaps they could realize how big Columbus is. Third largest city in the nation. There's 1 million people in the metro area already, more than that actually, and by 2050 they project there's going to be 3 million people who live here, right? You guys have obviously studied development in a lot of places. How does our current development strategies compare to those places, and what sort of things have you learned that people in Columbus maybe can learn?
I'll try a little bit. I mean, their housing looks kind of cheap to me, from my vantage point. I think that with these trends to proceed, which could well happen with climate refugees, find places like Columbus to be a great spot for land, that you will have more competition and you'll have to build faster than you're building right now to keep your supply and demand matched up. Some strategies, you're not getting a lot of help from your state in affordable housing. So creating a local fund to help create affordable housing, I think is more important. And I think you'll have to figure out how your housing can get built through fair and objective processes, rather than have fights over each development. I'm not saying there won't be fights, but the fight should happen at the zoning code level, not the project level. Come up to, because once the zoning code figures it out, then let people build it.
I don't know, I know one of the things that, like, I grew up here, I moved away for a while and came back, saw some other places. You know, one of the joys and pains of having 12 different offices, you see a lot of other cities. And I do think, to your point, like Columbus, we don't always, we sell ourselves short sometimes. I remember being in Milwaukee and thinking like, oh my gosh, this is a big city. They've got, you know, a baseball team and a basketball team and all this stuff. And then I looked it up and Milwaukee has 600,000 people. And you know, it's like it's 2/3 the size of Columbus. But I think one of the things that we're struggling with right now, I mean, I think you were kind of speaking my language, talking about the more we can do by right and not to, you know, fight things at the zoning level and on a project level. I think we're at a point where, you know, we passed something last week. Get my weeks mixed up, yeah, about the 1.5 billion, and there's a lot of funds in there for local affordable housing stuff. But I think we're still trying to unpack what that means, but that's a good thing locally. But it's still like, I think right now we're averaging 13 or 14,000 units a year that we're building, but the shortage is something like 54,000 of affordable units, and we need to be building somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 or 23,000 units a year. So every year we fall a little bit further behind, and I'm just at a point where I know that a lot of the fear around change is from bad developers or bad industry, but I'm like, we're falling so far behind so quickly that I'm almost like I'd welcome even the bad developers to say that, you know, because by fighting everything at the project level, we're actually preventing people with good intentions from doing good things as well. And the truth is, we need it all, even some of the bad stuff. Let the market sort that stuff out.
So this area is like not really a lot of thanks on your so Russian on the ocean, your lake, your mountain, wetlands, and place. But it's really easy to spread out, and that might be contributing to the long-term growth because you're kind of going with surrounding, or that's why we're part of town. You don't see the whole. But the problem, the downside, and it also keeps it affordable. Drive a little farther, drive to qualify. And if you're in the middle of the country, perhaps construction materials and supplies are cheaper here than other places. So you have a benefit of that in terms of housing. But the problem spreading out is that you're become much more part of the country. There's some set of problems, some set of economic impacts that we've experienced in the last couple months with gas prices and environmental impacts. And so, you know, you go far down that road, so to speak, and it's really hard.
So right right now we're in a suburb, obviously, right? And a lot of things, American dream, you gotta have a house, you gotta have a two-car garage, you gotta have, you know, a fence around everything, right? How does a single family homes fit into the idea of density, or is it like not a thing anymore? Like, you do not have, single family homes, how does that, those fit?
Well, I think, Eli, Campoli, we're kind of all, that's the idea, and they have four walls, that's on each side, and that's hard. It was wonderful. But, you know, due to the smaller scale. Now, there's one of them, that's still, I don't know, spread more, spread, and, but even territory, part of the big front, part of that, that, those empties are still, but I think it's important to realize that it's.
And it's following the boomers trajectory, where you go have a house in the suburbs, but now boomers are trying to get back to urban areas where they can walk because they're getting older and they want to be able to get to the doctor, get the transit. They can't drive anymore. So cities are reserving, and a lot of people are thinking them over the best home. People definitely vacation to get to their dream of seeing real cities where they're walking.
Color around choice. I think that this is something that hasn't been elevated in the conversation as it should be about affordability. Because we really do think about what is 800 square feet, so what's going to be, and it's got to be in a particular kind of building. The idea that you can have 800 square feet, which is where a single person or just a couple can reasonably live, and there's 7 or 8 different choices of design for that in any kind of neighborhood. That's something I think that really isn't in the public conversation quite as much as it should be. I know it is in Portland, but not quite.
And they're even in Portland, no one's banning a single family house.
Yeah.
It's just probably an alternative.
But I thought, like, even when you both had talked about it, the big jumping point for me in this one that we're dealing with all here is not the fact that it's single family homes, it's that the average single family home went from 1,100 square foot to 2,500. And you said that the number of users went from 2 to 3 per home to 1 to 2. And I struggle with it. My wife probably wouldn't appreciate me talking about our dialogue, but like when I moved here from LA, it's like I had 350 square foot studio and everything I own fit in a loft space here. And my wife said, we gotta have a bigger house. like we fit, but even with 4 of us, like 5 to 2 kids, we fit. But I think that's kind of and we've seen some of those too. There have been some creative approaches, even from new developments, even single families, where it's kind of in an area like this, but they'll find a plot of land and instead of building one house that's 2,500 square foot, they build 2 homes or 3 homes that are each 1,100 square feet. And I do think people are interested in that. Different than every other place. And it actually it brings proximity. It brings some of the things that we want, that you're closer to your neighbors, you're a little bit more walkable, but you also don't have the expense of heating and cooling and dealing with all the things that come along with 2,500.
Your book is about walking around for walking. What was the title? Pay for walking. And you went to the short north as part of that book. Are there things, lessons that you learned writing that book that might be applicable to today's conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, the short north basically a lot of the things that I studied, industrial area close to the downtown that involved a worker location, place for a lot of people for hard work and living their lives. And then it's back art in the 70s and And then the efforts to bring it back. Target, very fun. And then there's some momentum and it's more and more popular. And then the people that are using there that suffer through the hard times are no longer afford to be there. And they get like out and then the artist is replaced by different business types. And then the artists buy, kind of commercialize. I mean, I'm sort of jumping to what we I don't know, but this is fine. You know, I did research in 2008, back 2012, heading there, so I'm gonna check it out tomorrow. See how it came. But it is kind of a story of great success. And then, and the work that I'm interested in now is really how to do it. I think it's create a wonderful place like that little store that is a lively place for people to live and earn a living and have a sense of pride and identity about it without and then as we do building permanently, making sure that we do it through a process before while you're planning for that, that's doing economic development, you gotta expect, we might succeed at this, and we gotta prepare so that people don't get left.
Well, I think that's part of what excited me about it. I didn't call that in last week or Granny Flat was favorite, but you know, the overall movement around this neighborhood is where people feel types of housing displacement is the idea that you could say, you know, let's have that wealth creation conversation. So that if you could just build this thing in the back, that might help offset some of the tax implications or other things that lead to people feeling forced to sell a home. But you don't have to. But you, and then instead of saying it's a displacement, it's participating in wealth creation partner. And like you said, it's not always you know, it's usually not a developer, right? It's usually somebody who just doesn't know what they're doing and they're just trying to figure it out as they go. But right now, I think we're fairly lacking in terms of like educational. I'm like,
How bad do you think gentrification actually is? I know, like, we think it's really bad, but how bad is it now? Compared to other places, I guess.
It depends. So it depends on what neighborhoods you're talking about, and you know that's a subjective thing, right? And I think, like for example, like I think one of the big controversy it was a big controversy project we did on the near east side, which was a replacement or kind of Dexter Village, Church neighborhood project. And the reality was it was 600 or 700 units of abandoned housing, 600 units of mix of affordable and marketable housing. And the truth was it didn't displace any residents, but the perception was that it was going to drive prices or change. But and some of it, like you said, people fear change. Different. Like I knew so many people who grew up here, or I knew so many people that had histories or associations with these projects. But the reality was, it's like I still remember, you know, trying to explain or trying to articulate that we have these 6 foot by 6 foot double wide brick bedrooms that were like, you will never rent this to anybody, no matter how we renovate it. And you know, the 600 or 700 units that were replaced were not displacing anybody. If anything, they were just trying to welcome new residents. But it's often a feeling, right? But the counterpoint is what was I got all these numbers. I might have to borrow these. I was it 12 units per acre to get a corner store or a grocery store? Six for a corner store, 12 for a grocery store, right? But one of the things that come along with it is a lot of the food desert conversations. Like, well, you can't get a 60,000 square foot grocery store without a certain density of units. Right? So you have to have the displacement part of this.
Question of my name is now. This is Gail's question. She said, I'm a part of a group in Columbus and to build a co-housing community. what recommendations do you have to find land in the current real estate environment?
I guess that's for me because I'm a co-housing developer. Maybe catch me after for a little bit of that, but sometimes co-housing, you can do it at any scale. I mean, the project I showed was sort of single family residential scale, but there's also like 3-story building scale. Sometimes the best sites for co-housing, well, one, people who live in co-housing want to follow their values, so they want to be able to live without using car for everything. That's my experience, it may be different here. And sometimes co-housing projects, because of the layout, you can build them on sites that don't kind of fit the mold for the traditional greenfield developer. So maybe a weird triangular shaped property or something kind of funky, or maybe there's an existing house on it, or a few other structures that you can figure out what to do with, that some other developer couldn't figure out what to do with. That's I don't know your market well enough to know like what areas are good enough.
Jessica wants to know, how can we push for more accessible and affordable housing? Basically, what can people do basically to push for this?
I guess it depends on who.
Accessible means like visitable, like physically accessible.
Maybe that's what she means, accessible, like maybe you can buy it at Bill. I feel like this gets to a conversation we have in clubs a lot. What about, it's like, what is affordable housing and what does that actually look like for most people? I don't know, that's the question. Well, basically, what can people do to push for these things?
Well, I think, support zoning changes that allow for more density. I mean, that works at the city council and the councilor level. So talk to their local politicians, tell them that's something that they want, because that's going to make a huge difference.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, political pressure is part of it. I do think too that we need to have more of a conversation about what we mean, whether accessibility and affordability are not used. So if we get back to this, for some people, it doesn't seem that that's something that's a goal, and so we do need to actually have that conversation as well. The question about displacement versus gentrification. I mean, really what we're talking about in this region tends to be the question that housing prices are going up at a rate we did not anticipate and do not know how we were going to deal with it. The question of displacement is sort of coming behind this question of essentially rising housing prices, right? So it's almost a sort of across all the submarkets in the region. And then you have pockets like the Short North or German Village, which are very, very house markets for the region. So one of the things that's interesting to watch with our developers, and Jonathan's going to know this better than I do about the observation, is that the density is the developers in this region tend to be even more risk averse than most developers I'm used to observing in other contexts, meaning they want to build higher density in places that are already relatively well off, relatively dense, have those amenities. So not quite so it's maybe the Portland situation 15, 20 years ago, right? Where the neighborhoods that are already successful housing markets are becoming more dense, as opposed to the question of more distributing that the affordable housing throughout the region. And these are not actually affordable housing projects. High density projects are not necessarily affordable housing projects either. Often they aren't because they're going into these gentrified neighborhoods, as you identified shortly. So I think we do need to start, and I think the presentations today are helpful, defining categories more precisely about what we're talking, so that we actually are using the words that get us the outcomes in terms of the political outcomes and the policy and the zoning outcomes that are actually aligned with what sort of the public really wants to see in the region.
One second question for you, Jennifer. The city of Columbus just launched a zoning update. How is OSU advocating for innovative solutions like these? And how other institutions use their voice to advocate for housing and diversity?
I am not a spokesperson for the Ohio State. Yeah. But I mean, I can tell you a little bit. I think that what we're trying to do is look deliberately at what we can bring to the conversation. So that is a perspective that brings in the perspective from other places, like what happened today when we got perspectives from other places, looking at best practices. And also, I think advocating for the idea that there is you can't just sit on something for 30 years and say that it's going to get you the results you want when the world is changing around you. And so updates to zoning code, and that is a persistent part of our practice rather than something that we just very painfully, open the box every 30 years and say, oh my God, I don't want to deal with this. Instead, to have more of a persistent conversation so that we're not lagging with and enabling some of this innovation. I suppose the lesson tonight is that innovation gets you closer to what you want in terms of design outcomes and choice, instead of limiting those options.
So, in my experience, universities aren't, the role of advocating is not strong. But universities are essential for studying and educating. And a lot of the information from my presentation is because Cornell State University studied how people actually use ADUs. So you wouldn't know if they weren't there studying it. Also researching best practices from other communities and bringing them here, and elevating local examples that are successful, and educating, getting people out to see them. Universities can do that too.
This is a question for Julie, which is that design is certainly subjective. In addition to creating regulations that define and mandate more thoughtful design buildings, what recommendations do you and other panelists have on framing the conversation for those that don't like the look or don't like the color?
Just have to use a lot of images when you have these conversations. Take a lot of photographs of the. Have a lot of take photographs, send people out and have them take photographs of the buildings that they love. Really focus on the parts of town that people agree are wonderful. And then, and isn't to say that you build something exactly like that. You look at them and say, hey, what's going on here? Why do people like this so much? What are the design principles that are attached to this, or that make this place so wonderful? And you might need to work with a design professional, you probably do, to kind of distill what that is. But I find that, visual information where people say, I like this, I don't like that, I like this about that. It helps them understand aesthetic choices more. It helps them understand what they want. It helps them understand their community more. And then you can just build a bank of images, distill some principles from it, and use that as the basis of what you think is good design. It's going to vary from place to place. It shouldn't be the same, in Portland as it is in Columbus, or as it is in Burlington. It's all very different places. So they just have to do that, have that conversation with lots of
This is another quick question. This is a quick question, I think, maybe not. Do ADUs typically increase or decrease property value?
That's a quick one. They typically increase property value, but not by as much as it costs to build the ADU. So people, nobody in this country is building ADU, buying properties, building ADU and flipping it, selling it. As a cash flow thing, though, they do make sense. So people can, in some markets, I don't know if your market rents are high enough, can borrow money to build the ADU, and then make more from rental income than they are to pay back the loan that they borrowed. And you've got some value added to the cost.
So like Shauna, actually, you're very popular. Can you discuss the total development cost rate and also how they have been successfully funded?
The sexiest ADUs are the most expensive ones. They're detached, separate structure, built from the ground up. The cheapest ones nowadays are like $150,000 to build it. Now your market may be less expensive for construction than mine is. They can easily be over 200. The inexpensive way to do ADUs is to convert space you already have. So it may be an extra garage area or basement or an attic or part of the first floor you don't use. Those could be just as much as like $20,000 to put a kitchen in somewhere. And put a partition, well, usually it's more than that, but you can, the most discreet ADUs are the least expensive ones, if you got a place for it.
We were talking about ADUs. Second part of this question from Jeffrey is if ADUs have been utilized to address NIMBY issues with supportive housing, how do they fit into the whole, like, not in my backyard? So
I think ADUs are the, there's always concern about infill development, every community you go to. ADUs are the most acceptable form of infill. So if there's a community trying to decide what are we gonna do here, and they want to do something, then ADUs rise to the top. Because it's supposed to be palatable and because people are familiar with building.
okay, so this is a question too. How do you deal with developers who, even in progressive towns, always seem to win? There's a whole fishbowl between.
So it always seems to win.
Yeah, you always seem to win those. How do we deal with it?
Well, I think call it risk aversion, call it being cheap. I think that's my perspective. Call it just frustration, but most developers, they, there are certain communities that kind of develop reputations for being passionate. I'll put it that way. And basically, you run into a lot of developers that basically say that they choose not to develop in certain neighborhoods. They don't feel like dealing with it. Like, and I think where I do get frustrated, where I would say, the question about like developers who always win, is, partially framed on the way that they, projects are killed before they even start. And you don't see those as losses because you will come to some areas, hunting commissions or other places, and they'll just flat out tell a developer, it's going to take you at least 18 months to get this project. And it's like, well, based on, rent rates and cash flows and interest rates, it's like, well, I don't even try. So I think maybe I'm just kind of dancing around a little bit, but it's like, I think I see so many projects that we've studied or looked at, or someone's considering buying a property, and then they look at kind of the detail of what it's going to take to get it approved, and they're like, not dealing with it. And then they'll go to an outer ring of 270 and say, I'll put these 3-story walk-ups and I'll rent them for 3 times as much. And from there.
How housing is built, how it's financed, what developers do, what kind of risks they take. There's just a broad spectrum of different types of developers, and some are just in it for the worst reasons, and some are very responsible. But they all kind of are motivated by this desire to build something. And I think we have a tendency to, not because we don't know very many developers, and we always sort of, in many communities, especially progressive, nice. And it's helpful to point out to people that some of the towns that the parts of towns they really love were built by a developer. It might have been 100 years ago, but that's how a lot of housing gets built. And that's kind of the system that we have. So it really helps to understand it so that you can have a more intelligent conversation.
You always make it.
I try and build where I don't have to, I do clear objective standards, but I have gone through the discretionary process more than other developers because I affordable housing background helped me go through that process. But I've had protest signs in front of my development about that info. Everything looks awful when it's plywood box, right? And you get motivated.
So what, if any, role do you see for land use, land value tax as a way to promote and ensure density in urban areas?
It's a great idea. Do you guys have a political path to get there? And it's not all or nothing on land value tax. I mean, you can put more good, right?
Okay. And the state,
It's a great idea.
is it state or city? But I don't think it's any secret based on what we've seen the last few weeks that we're going to have a lot more direct fights between city and state about what cities can do versus what the state says. And that's where we're headed. Like,
So as, like, what is the timetable on Columbus and Franklin County going you to allow ADAs and more density? Should all?
I'm still lumping it into kind of what we're anticipating we'll hear with the update in the zoning code. I think everything we're hearing, that they're gathering information, they're listening, they're gonna do studies, they're gonna do studies and say that they listened and say that they did studies, and they're talking about summer of 24, is what I've heard. But what I've also heard is what they really need in the process is they need everybody to show up and participate and tell your horror stories about, maybe it's just my horror stories about projects that couldn't get approved, where all the things were right, or somebody just saying, hey, I really wanted to do this. Like, even, for example, like you asked about the legacy house, and it was a 750 square foot home on a, it straddled two lots in Linden, but based on city law, or, basically that you can't build a house below a certain size on a certain lot. And it's like, so wait, if we were to build a 2,000 square foot home, we're approved, but because we're building a 750 square foot home, we have to rezone.
House size average zoning.
Yeah, it's one of these, but it's basically, it's the more things that show up that say that you can do it by right, or that I just say, look in the mindset from, yes, you can build, as opposed to no, you can't.
So there are other things that you want on zoning. That,
I'll speak positively. I still remember the two things I saw recently that blew my mind. One was, I call Detroit, city of Detroit has something that I call it the close enough rule, where, you got 100 units and, if you have to do 2 spaces per unit, but you can only, so you gotta have 200 spaces, but you can only fit 197 spaces. And then Detroit, I call it the close enough committee. There's a committee that basically just says, you're close enough, and they are not, if you're within a certain range of the code, you don't have to rezone the whole project just to say, hey, 197 spaces is close enough to 200. I thought that was like, lovely, yes. And then the other thing that blew my mind was, I don't think this has a chance here, but California state law that says that local communities cannot prevent, basically, if you are building affordable housing in California because the need is so great, it is approved, and it's actually illegal for a local jurisdiction to say that you can't build it if you're building affordable housing. That's like, because I remember we had this project in San Jose where we were asking about what is our height limitation, and when we talked to the city and they said, you're building 100% affordable, we're like, yes. They're like, what is the FAA clearance? Well, there's no, it's basically saying we need you to build this affordable housing. So the state law is written to encourage it.
well, we definitely need some houses around here, so.
Something out that Jonathan was talking about earlier, the issue of fighting every battle by every project, or having it actually enabled through the zoning code. One of the things that happens when you need a variance for every project is you elongate these timelines, and the only people who can actually afford to go through that process, to hire all the land use lawyers and do all this are the largest developers, the most established developers, and often the least innovative developers.
And the ones that are building high-end houses.
Yeah, and so this is, for some of you who know the housing market here well, you might see some evidence of this in some of the things that we see. So the issue of having to make it very expensive in terms of the timeline, it also really limits the innovation for the smaller firms. So one of the things that we've seen in places like Portland that have a more progressive zoning code is the emergence of smaller developers, more innovative developers who do all sorts of different kinds. Some of them are here with us today. And that's something, sitting in an architecture school myself, those are some of the things that I think we'd really like to see here. And in terms of being innovative and entrepreneurial in this region, that opportunity, as we see the demand for housing grow, is something that we could really think about doing. And, maybe Columbus as a design center for the kind of diversity and housing choice, rather than the more conventional development that we.
This is gonna be our final question from Matthew. One frequent concern of neighbors when high density housing is proposed is that it might bring down the property value is it the job of the government to use zoning to preserve the investment returns of property owners? Is this a legitimate concern?
Well, I think it's very well studied, it's concerned, but it's not a reality. When the higher density housing goes in, except for a few egregious examples, tends to increase the value of housing.
You know, that high rise in Atlantic City, shopping. That's the one exception.
I thank everybody for paying attention, and hopefully you've learned something today. Let's thank our panelists. We have Jennifer and Jonathan and Eli and Julie. We want to thank all the sponsors, of course. We want to thank you for watching. And also, we have a group called Neighbors for More Neighbors in the audience. If you guys are here, can you please wave your hand and take a much different care. So, 6 o'clock. Fantastic.